Chapter 35. Pelkar was dead, gone in a burst of light that seemed to have come from the dragon. It had happened so suddenly Duncan wasn't quite sure what to do, but he had barely been hanging in there against the mage goblin, and knew that the dragon had saved his life. Duncan just hoped it was on his side, and that it wasn't about to attack him. The fighting raged on around him, and he had to stop himself from looking at Sam's lifeless body, as there was no time to dwell on it. Killing Pelkar had not destroyed the magical enslavement that he had placed on the thousands of human teenagers in this realm. Feeling the power of the magic in his sandsword, he suddenly thought about another way he could use it. Do I really need to touch a person to free them of goblin magic? He extended his sandsword even further, making it into more of a whip. He then swept it around until it touched one of the Kingsguard. There was only 15 of them remaining on their side of the fiery barrier, and as his magical whip touched the first, he felt his magic flow through the weapon. He sensed the prison around her mind, and used all of his anger, all of his grief and his hatred, to shatter it. The girl fell back, freed and confused, as Duncan shouted out that he had freed her. 14 more flicks of his magical whip, and the area went still, except for the ominous shadow of the dragon that swept across them. The creature, whose appearance had saved them, began to descend. As it got lower, and the bright sky of the Ivory Realm became less blinding behind it, it began to resolve itself into something other than a dragon. It was a giant bird, with what appeared to be a small girl on its back. The closer it got, the more familiar that girl seemed. One boy shouted fearfully, "It's the fairy demon!" The statement was supported by the sight of 2 fairies flying alongside the girl, but Duncan could not believe his own eyes as he became sure that the young girl riding on the back of the giant bird, and holding what appeared to be a ball of fire in her hand, was his little sister. "Ellie?" he questioned, feeling as if he had lost his mind. How can she be here? He struggled to believe what he was seeing. He was confused whether to be worried for his little sister at the thought of her in the middle of a battlefield, or inspired and wary of how powerful she appeared when riding a magical creature and controlling the elements. Either way, it was good to see a familiar face. I wonder if Mum and Dad are with her, he thought, although there was no sign of any adults. The giant bird landed with a bit of a crash, skidding along the ground with its face in the dirt. The girl was not hurt and she jumped off. As she bounded free, the bird shrunk to the size of a regular pigeon, with a goblin standing beside it, and the girl ran up to him. The ball of fire disappeared from her hand and she threw her arms around him and squealed, "Duncan!" "What are you doing here? How did you get here?" he asked, the first of many questions rushing through his mind.
"I came to rescue you. Rake, the tooth fairy, brought me,"
she said, as if that explained everything. Ellie began speaking very fast, and Duncan was struggling to understand what she was saying. It was an avalanche of words, many that Duncan didn't understand, mostly about different forms of magic. While Duncan was stunned by how much his little sister seemed to have learned about magic, her young-sounding voice and her habit of talking too fast when she was excited made her barely comprehensible. But Duncan figured out the basic message. She had created that magical barrier of fire that was containing King Umkra and what remained of his army, but it wasn't going to last much longer, and they had to work out what to do. Duncan knew that there were many of the Kingsguard in there, innocent teenage girls that deserved to be freed. He also knew that they would attack him as soon as the barrier failed. There were several goblins in there with them who would order them to attack. Duncan's sandwhip couldn't stop them all fast enough, not without any of them getting hurt.
"That whip is what you used to free them from the mage goblin spell?"
Ellie asked him. Not exactly, it just acts as a bridge for my magic, he said, and was surprised that she nodded as if that made perfect sense to her.
"Can you hold the magic in the sand?"
she asked calmly. It was a strange concept to Duncan, and as he thought about it, experimenting with the sand in his sword, it did feel like something was happening. It felt like each grain of sand was becoming a tiny spell of its own, that would attack the magic that infested the minds of the enslaved teenage humans. The sand before him began to form a ball in his hand, one that he thought he might be able to let go of, and it maintain its magic.
"More,"
whispered his sister, a strange whisper that sounded unfamiliar and far older than the 10-year-old girl he knew. He obeyed, drawing more sand to him, making the swirling ball larger, filling it with more magic, as much as it could hold. When it began to feel like the weight of the magical sand he was holding might crush him, his sister stepped back and pointed a stick. His old toy wand, he realized, at the swirling sphere. A whirlwind formed under it and around it, lifting it out of his hand into the air. Controlling a chaotic twister of wind, she guided the sphere of magical sand, lifting it over the barrier of fire. It continued its journey until it reached the centre of the compound that held the king, his few remaining goblin officers, and his dozens of Kingsguard. Duncan saw Ellie's eyes flash with gold half a second before the sky filled with lightning. Several bolts struck downward, meeting at the ball of sand and exploding it in every direction. Ellie collapsed to the ground, looking spent. As she fell, so too did the wall of magical fire, but it didn't matter anymore. Duncan could feel each grain of that magical sand as it touched an enslaved girl and freed her from the magic. The dozens of girls in their fine armour, who had been Umkar's elite soldiers and trusted bodyguard, turned on the king and the remaining goblins. Free of the magic, free to act with their own minds for the first time in years, they mercilessly attacked their dark masters. For over an hour they searched the camp and found a number of trainee boys hiding. Duncan freed every boy they found, while the two fairies did their best to heal the injuries of the freed humans, boys and Kingsguard alike. Duncan was immensely pleased when they found Roptek. He was tied up, but upon hearing the order to protect the king, his guards had simply abandoned him. They kept a watch in case of a further attack, but it remained quiet apart from the sobbing of joy from some of the newly freed teenagers. Eventually, Duncan had time to talk to his sister properly. "Tell me everything, sis," he invited. Ellie began with the eve of his birthday, seeing him taken by goblins and meeting a tooth fairy. She moved through so much so quickly, and he began weaving his own story into hers as she asked where he had been. She spoke a lot about Merlin, and not a lot of it made sense. But he didn't really feel like this was his little sister anymore. In some ways she felt a lot older than him now. She talked about a destiny that they, the descendants of Merlin, had to protect the world. She said that it began with stopping Umkar, stopping this war against the fairies. Duncan agreed with her completely, although for different reasons. She had been told that it was her destiny. Duncan had promised himself that he would do all he could to bring down Umkar, to free the humans and goblins that had been enslaved. Roptek had been sat nearby, while the fairies Rake and Fliss, and her guide Figwhip, had not strayed too far from Ellie. Fliss offered a comment at that point.
"Destroying Umkar and Pelkar, along with the human training camp, will be a huge blow to the goblin horde. We will have to see if anyone else can take control of it, or if the goblin clans split and go back to warring among themselves. However, Ellie, I think you have done enough. We fairies will find a way to deal with it ourselves. We may find allies in places we did not expect,"
she said, shooting a calculating glance at the battle-weary figure of Roptek. Then Rake offered, "I'll make a portal for you and your brother to go home now, but I will visit from time to time if that's okay." Ellie shed a tear at the fairy's words.
"Of course, you must come and visit."
A voice that was full of authority interrupted them, cutting through the emotion Ellie was feeling. "No one will be making any portals until I have discussed matters with Ellie Melson." The gliding figure of Purst, the rather regal-looking fairy elder, appeared with a sheepish-looking Blake at her side. Hanging back were several other fairies that moved to join Fliss, so Ellie guessed that they were explorer fairies working for the Fairy Intelligence Bureau. "Purst, I can explain," began Rake, but a sharply raised hand and a stern look silenced him. "I'm sure you can, but I will deal with you later," she told the Tooth Fairy before speaking to Ellie. "Well, descendant of Merlin, Blake tells me that you have had quite an adventure, and have learned a great deal." She paused, looking around at the teenage boys and girls that had been freed from their enslavement. "Perhaps sneaking off with a few of our more adventurous fairies was always your destiny, and I would have been foolish to have tried to stop you. But I must beg you to stay and finish what you have begun, to help us make sure the goblin horde is stopped." Ellie couldn't help feeling that Purst was right, but she had to get back to her parents.
"Did Blake tell you that I spoke to Merlin?"
she asked, and the elder nodded.
"Well, Merlin told me that there was a prophecy, that the chosen, descended from him, would be needed to rebalance the world."
"Go on," whispered Purst, sensing that Ellie had more to say. Ellie continued.
"Umkar was ambitious and greedy. He was more cruel than most goblins, but he was not an exception. He was not what had destroyed the balance in this realm. Pelkar was something different, something more. I don't know what, and nothing I learned from Merlin explains it. But I know I'm right. I have stopped Pelkar, and I believe that without him, the goblin armies will not last long."
"Perhaps," admitted Purst, "but you are young, and I suspect that fate is not finished with you yet." A reflective pause followed, but Ellie's brother broke it. "Ellie," he said gently, "I'm not coming home." She looked at him in disbelief. He tried to explain. I have a lot to do here still. I can't leave thousands of humans enslaved. We will regroup in the fairylands, and make our plans to defeat what remains of Umkar's forces." Ellie listened, absorbing his words with far more maturity than he might have expected.
"What about me?"
she asked, with a tear forming in her eye.
"And Mum and Dad?"
"Mum and Dad won't even know I'm gone. They have my clone to take care of. Besides, with a sister like you, he might even turn into a nice guy. But you don't have a clone, Ellie. You must go home." She nodded.
"I know.
She said as she hugged him tightly.
I'll come visit,"
she promised. Epilogue. Ellie watched as Charlie took a breath and stepped through the portal, back into his bedroom from where he had been kidnapped by tooth goblins a few weeks earlier. He was very different from the boy that had been taken, Ellie knew. Of those that had asked to go home rather than stay with Duncan, he was the first she was returning. Charlie had asked what the fate of his clone would be, to which Perst had stated flatly that the magically created clone could be unmade quite easily. But Charlie had not been comfortable with the idea, and had mumbled, "Well, I always wanted a brother." That had got Ellie thinking, searching through the ideas and memories that Merlin had implanted into her mind. Discussing some ideas with her fairy friends and the fairy elder, they had come up with a plan. Charlie stood in his bedroom, beside the sleeping clone of himself that the mage goblins had grown from one of his old discarded teeth. Watching the two versions of Charlie, Rake created a thought bubble, but he did not use it immediately. It contained the idea that Charlie and his clone were twins. Ellie used her magic to enhance the thought bubble, increasing its power. However, the chaotic nature of her human magic also changed the nature of the spell, making it less contained, changing it into a thought aura. Instead of affecting only the mind of the person the bubble was inserted into, the aura would make all who met either Charlie or his clone believe that they were twins, and would confuse them into believing that they had always known it. Charlie was pleased with the idea of having a new brother, and as Rake and Ellie let the thought aura settle upon the two of them, Charlie smiled at his new brother. The clone woke briefly, and smiled back at the boy he now believed had always been his twin. The end.